Let's bring in Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut. He's a member of the Judiciary Committee, which will hold a hearing this morning with FBI Director Kash Patel. Senator, we'll get to that hearing in just a moment, but would love for you to weigh in on the conversation we've been having around the table this morning about calming the temperature, about condemning political violence wherever it comes from. How has that changed for you, or what has your view been and your feel of Washington over the last week since the murder of Charlie Kirk?
The killing of Charlie Kirk was a tragedy, as were every one of these instances of political violence that have occurred in recent times. And, of course, going back to the 1960s, I remember Robert Kennedy's speech well, and it had a calming influence, even though there were riots in some of the cities. But the really menacing and malevolent language, the overheated rhetoric that we see coming from some leaders today smacks of a political witch hunt and persecution designed to intimidate and suppress speech. So I am really deeply alarmed by the trend of some of these comments. And in the law, there's a clear distinction between the speech that is designed to incite violence, which can be contained, but other speech is permitted, and the broad, expansive view of speech is important.
So, Senator, let's follow up there with this idea of the Attorney General, the Vice President, other top officials saying they're going to mobilize the powers of the federal government to crack down on who they perceive to be their political foes. That includes like left-wing NGOs, these are their words, and the like. You know, how can the Senate, how can Congress, how can Democrats act as a bulwark here if indeed they follow through?
We're going to begin today with Kash Patel, the director of the FBI, as a witness. I want to know from him whether he's going to weaponize the FBI as a political instrument against opponents of the president. He came to this office in a campaign of retribution. We asked him directly about it. I asked him whether there would be political retribution against FBI agents. He lied to us. And he promised that all FBI employees would be protected against retribution. This campaign of vengeance is potentially part of a crackdown on political opponents that we ought to counter in the Congress. And I think it begins today with this hearing, but we all ought to speak against it because, you know, as the saying goes, what comes around goes around. And the political violence in this country has reached a height that ought to be condemned by everyone.
Senator, the conversation we were talking about before with Attorney General Pam Bondi and the podcaster, I noted another photo that took place underneath the portrait of RFK Jr. or of RFK that, as Mike noted, amazingly still hangs at the Department of Justice. But that night in Indianapolis, there was a lot of grace that RFK showed, talked about as a white man who a black hero was killed by another white man. Same kind of grace, I guess, showed. You pointed to Governor Cox as someone who is who's a model for how we should be, you know, particularly from Republican officials, how you want to hear from them. What do you see, in addition to the hearing, ways that you can highlight this kind of grace?
That's a great question. The hearing is sometimes a blunt instrument. As you know, we're limited in time and the kinds of questions we can ask. But I think that the hearing ought to emphasize the appeal to our better angels, not our worst demons, which is what Governor Cox did, I think, in the immediate aftermath when he talked about bringing our country together, touching the grass, being real, and trying to impart a calming message. And going back to Kash Patel in the hearing today, he has an obligation to enforce the law without political favor or fear. The suspect in the Charlie Kirk hearing has not been linked to any political group, any nonprofit. The past killings have not prompted the kind of political crackdown against groups with particular ideologies. And the rhetoric that we're seeing, I think, has to be de-escalated and deconflicted. And the hearing provides an opportunity to begin in our questioning of Patel. And we also want to know, I think we should know, why he's disbanded the domestic terrorism operations of the FBI. He's literally reassigned those agents in Washington who are responsible for investigating and preventing domestic terrorism. He's undercut essential law enforcement functions of the FBI, in addition to bungling the beginning of the Kirk investigation.
Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, thank you very much for coming on the show this morning.